Okay, everybody, I've done 2 videos on Dark Shadows. I've decided I would try to maybe give some people some insight who are fans of the show. Now, I'm not a fanatic, okay? I'm not saying I know everything about Dark Shadows, because I haven't even seen half of the 1968, 69, and 70 seasons of the show when they went back in time, that second event where they met Quentin and all the rest of it. I've never even seen those. But looking over everything that Barnabas went through when they introduced him, I would say there were 3 distinct things which made Barnabas the unlikely villain, because he never had any release from the inevitable reality that he faced, which was he was a vampire and there was no way to get rid of that vampirism. Yes, they did at one point have a doctor who was able to cure him of it to a point, but I think Angelique cursed him again and he got it back, so I don't think he stayed normal for very long. He was able, I think, to come out into daylight later on. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to remember, was that maybe in that movie, The House of Dark Shadows? Or maybe it was The Night of Dark Shadows, because they did a color movie based on the series, and then they went back and did another movie based on Quentin. That was The House of Dark Shadows, about Quentin. But one of the things, if you guys watch every episode of Dark Shadows, or try to watch most of them, I never saw a crucifix. I never saw a cross anywhere in the TV show. Why? It was not because Dan Curtis was not religious. I think what he was trying to say to people was nobody had the smarts or the idea to assume that a vampire could only be killed certain ways, or at least that he could be released from this curse in certain fashions. The crucifix represents Jesus dying on the cross and paying for the sins of the world, and Satan cannot stand to look at that. Now, that's one distinctive way to kill a vampire, or at least that if you can have him look at it, it draws him away. Number 2, there's holy water, which cannot really kill a vampire. They could have drowned Barnabas. If you put a vampire in water, they will sink. They cannot swim in water, and therefore he probably would have drowned. But they didn't introduce that idea either. But see, these are all known facts from known folklore that's existed for at least 100 years about vampirism, how you could actually kill somebody who is a vampire. The third way that they never even thought about is to drive a wooden stake through their heart. That is the only known credible way to kill a vampire and actually release the soul of the person who is actually cursed, and that's to take out their heart. You put a stake through the heart, you leave it in there, that stops it from beating, and thereby the vampire dies out, and that's it. Now, in Barnabas and in Dark Shadows, I don't think he ever actually created followers. As far as if he bit people, I don't think they ever became vampires. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but from what I've seen so far, I don't think he ever had any other followers or what I call disciples, because he didn't probably figure it was the best thing to do. Since he's cursed, he didn't want anybody else to go through this. But there were ways to release him from his curse, and all they tried to do was to use sort of like current scientific methods to do that, and there was no way they were going to be able to release him. Why? Because I know it would have been the end of the TV series. Well, you still could have done things with those conceptions, those ideas, and they never even brought them up in the series. And that's why I think in that regard Dan Curtis was doing a disservice to Barnabas by not having brought those subjects to the forward, using known facts and known ways of getting rid of vampires by using methods that, maybe he didn't want people to to know that he could have been released from what Angelique had done to him, because he wanted to keep the show going as long as he could. But that's not really the point either. It's the fact that he brought him back in time to other points in history. So if they could have cured Barnabas, that would have put a closure to him as a character, to say he finally got peace. You know, he wanted peace. He didn't want to be like that forever. If they could have done that and ended it, then they could have had Victoria winners to go back to other time periods in history, not only to see how Barnabas was as a person before he became a vampire, but also that he could have lived out a normal life with her there in that time period until the show was canceled. But they never did any of that. And that's what's, to me, that's an unknown ending to Barnabas and to Dark Shadows, that there was no closure to him finding peace as a vampire from what he had been through. Because it was a great idea to do that, to make a vampire for a series that was failing, which is why Dan Curtis did it. He knew if he didn't bring in vampires, werewolves, other characters into the show, it would have flopped, and he wouldn't have been able to continue it after 1967. But when you're doing a series that lasted for 5 years, as did, Dark Shadows, you have to find a way to put closure to it. Otherwise, there will always be that question mark of why was Barnabas he was never allowed to find peace. One example I do have to bring up, and a lot of people have already seen this series, is called Salem's Lot. This starred David Soul, amongst other actors. Lou Ayres was in it, Jeffrey Lewis. And the premise of Salem's Lot is very, very similar to Dark Shadows. You had the house at the top of the hill, which, by the way, if you go inside of it, if you saw the inside of the house, it looked very much like Collinwood. You had Barlow, who was the vampire himself, and James Mason's character was the henchman, who kind of was, he went before Barlow got to wherever town they were going, because he had to have a place to set up his coffin, and then to create havoc in the town where he was. And kind of James Mason's character would be similar to John Carlin, who was Willie Loomis in Dark Shadows. Willie Loomis was his Jonathan Harkin from the original Dracula. He was his stagehand, his stooge, his cohort, the person who helped him in everything he did. He took him wherever he needed to go. He was there. And the idea that Dark Shadows did not have closure is not the same for Salem's Lot, because at the end of the movie, they were able to kill Barlow with a wooden stake in his heart. They burned down the house, leaving the vampires to die inside the house in the basement. And as far as I know, the only person who they brought back in the story at the end was David Soul's girlfriend, and she hunted him down to a monastery somewhere in Mexico or in South America, and he drove a stake through her heart too. So he killed her off. Now, I know that he had said to the boy, others will come now. Other people will find us. And David Soul said this, yes, but we've killed off most of those that are still there. And when they set fire to the house, if you remember this part of the movie, the boy had said to David Soul, the town will burn. And David Soul said, yes, but that will drive them out of their hiding places, which means that all of those that were in the barn or in the basements of those homes would either have been killed by the fire, or it would have forced them out into the daylight, and then they would have been killed from the daylight. So Dark Shadows was a wonderful gothic horror series, but it also had a lot of question marks that were never answered or closed because either Dan Curtis did not have the insight to say, I need to find a way of closing this thing as far as showing people that Barnabas did find peace at the end, or do something whereby Barnabas could have found peace one way or another, and then they could have ended the series where we saw the better part of his life through Victoria's experiences. That's what they should have done, but they didn't. So I've already posted this subject. I'm going to close off this video by saying this. My mother watched Barnabas and she watched Dark Shadows even before 1966. And in my other videos, which are called The Unknown Truth of Dark Shadows, I've brought out two facts that I've learned. Number one, the series was aired in 1956 or 1955. Dan Curtis probably had an idea to do Dark Shadows. It failed, but when he started the series in 55, he already had Barnabas in it. When he saw that there wasn't enough fan base because it was so early in television's history as far as television shows, he canceled it. Then ABC offered him a chance about roughly 7 or 8 years later to come back and do the show again, and that's what everybody now remembers. He started the series out with just doing stories about the Collins family, and then he faced Barnabas into it because he figured, if I can start it off where it is a melodrama, then bring Barnabas into it, it might actually take off and go for years, which it did. It went for 5 years before it was finally canceled. But he did do it once before. He did do a series based on Dark Shadows, probably with a totally different cast. Catherine Scott was not there, neither was Alexandra Moltke. She wasn't in it. I don't know of whether Jonathan Fred had been in it the first time, but that's what my mother had said to me. And she never did change her mind about that. She even says it right to this day. So if you want to hear her own comment and her own assumption about Dark Shadows, then I would recommend you go back and watch the other two videos that I've done about Dark Shadows before, because her recollection is that ABC aired the series only one time. It had Barnabas. As a matter of fact, it was probably not called Dark Shadows the first time. It was just simply called Barnabas. It failed. And then after 10 years or 6 or 7 years, ABC gave him a second chance to do it again. This time he brought all the original cast that we all know into it. Lewis Edmonds, Joan Bennett, Thayer David, David Ford, who was Sam Evans, all of those people came into it. But it was not an original idea that Dan Curtis had. He had done the whole thing before once, and then at the very end of it, he found that it just wasn't at the right time in the history of how television had just started, that he could probably figure it would have lasted. So I guess probably ABC canceled it. They tested it probably as a pilot idea, and it aired for so long, and then it was canceled after that. It probably only lasted a year, because my mother was telling me, she said, I only remember seeing it up until the time I graduated from high school, and she said that was in 1957. And then after that, she said, I don't remember it. And then all of a sudden, they started airing the show again, which we all know when that was, in 1966. So, in a nutshell, that's all I can tell you all about Dark Shadows, because that's all that I've ever heard of from my mother. That's the only thing I know of as far as knowing something about horror and about storylines on the basis of vampires. And Buffy the Vampire Slayer and all the other shows that have been done since have all based themselves on the idea of what was presented in Dan Curtis's Dark Shadows movie, or in his TV show. If anybody has seen Johnny Depp's version of Barnabas in Dark Shadows, don't see it, because it was a very mediocre attempt at bringing this story into a current time and using the premise that it was still from the 1970s. It flopped. Nobody liked it. So don't watch it. It was not worth it. If you want to see any movies, see the original movies that MGM released of Joan Bennett and the rest of the cast.